It was early 1972. Video games were still in their infancy and arcades had begun attracting people to the idea of exploring brave new worlds. The home computing scene was still a few years off, and a young Alfred Milgram had just finished a science degree at the University of Melbourne. He and 4 friends decided to set up a book publishing enterprise, Outback Press Australia. After a few years, it became apparent that American publishers were resistant to selling Australian rights to their titles. There seemed to be a better market for this in the UK, so together with his partner Naomi Benson, he relocated there and launched Melbourne House Publishing in 1978. It was around this time that Sinclair, the original home computer giant, was getting ready to launch their ZX80 line. Alfred, poring over an article in the Australian Financial Review, became excited by the prospect of this emerging medium. He realised an early foray would position Melbourne House at the forefront of an exciting new industry. Alfred wrote one of the first books ever written for the home computer market, 30 Programs for the ZX80. Sir Clive Sinclair apparently had his secretary read it and, based on her feedback, gave it his endorsement. It gained widespread acclaim, selling a large volume of copies and cementing Melbourne House as a publisher to watch. Regardless of this success, the pair began to feel homesick and returned to Australia in 1980. Taking the first 2 initials from Naomi's last name and combining it with his own initials, Alfred formed Beam Software. The aim was to produce computer programming books and software, which would be published by Melbourne House UK. In early December of 1980, Beam's first employee signed up, William Tang. A university student with a great attitude and a talent for coding began working out of Alfred and Naomi's living room. Realising they had all the ingredients of a budding game development team, Alfred changed direction, creating history and cementing Beam as the first ever Australian video game developer. William's first effort was a port of the acclaimed Space Invaders for the ZX80. Unfortunately, it was derailed by the announcement of the new ZX81. This taught Beam a very important lesson about the speed of home computer evolution and the need to get to market in time to maintain brand recognition. In 1982, William began work on a mascot game to compete with the likes of Pac-Man and Frogger. The strange character was named Horace and became so popular that his game was packaged with the brand new ZX Spectrum. He introduced a generation of youngsters to video gaming. The first title, Hungry Horace, was inspired by Pac-Man and sees him running around mazes munching flowers and avoiding enemies. I still can't tell what he is. Maybe he's related to Grug or the Gobbledog. The second game, Horace Goes Skiing, is fairly complex for the time. Gameplay takes place across 2 sections, the first being a Frogger-style freeway where you can cross the road and use cash to buy a set of skis. The next part sees Horace skiing down a slope between flags. If he stacks, he must return across the road to the store to buy another set before trying again. It's super cool to see such variety in gameplay. Keeping with the theme of variety, the third and final game has Horace taking on his arachnophobia. In the first section, Horace climbs a hill while jumping over the arachnids. The second has him swinging across pits using webs, while the third section sees him creating holes in the webs. The spiders then try to fix them, only to be squished unceremoniously when doing so. There was a 4th game planned but never released as William suffered a collapsed lung. It seems he continued to work as a programmer but eventually disappeared from the industry, and to this day, no one is really certain of what happened to him. The government! His contribution to the Australian video game industry cannot be understated. He was one of our earliest pioneers. If you're still out there somewhere, thanks for doing your best for us, mate. In 1982, Adam Lanceman joined Beam as an accountant. At first, he had limited knowledge of the gaming scene, but quickly educated himself, becoming managing director of the company. He was the face of Beam Software to the industry, often spending months at a time away from his family. He really cared about the industry down under, eventually becoming president of the Game Developers Association, where he worked tirelessly for the good of all Aussie game devs.
We're doing what the federal government is asking Australian companies to do, and that is bring in more export income, be internationally competitive, and that's what we're doing.
He sadly passed away in 2006, but what an absolute legend. Australian gamers, thank you for your amazing contribution to our industry. Following up the Horace trilogy was never going to be easy, but in 1982, Beam's first major license was produced in The Hobbit for various home computers. The game was developed by Philip Mitchell and Veronica Megler, who were known for their insistence on completing projects to a high standard. It was released with the book of the same name and soared to #1 in Europe. It offered a watershed moment for text adventures by including a parser, courtesy of programmer Stuart Ritchie. Moving away from the simple verb-noun inputs of similar games of the time, it catered for complex phrases that could combine 2 or more commands. The game was considered by many to be an atmospheric experience and became the biggest selling Spectrum game of all time. It also has the distinct honour of being Australia's first major gaming export. Its success made Beam very receptive to the idea of licensed games, which would come to define them in their later years. In 1983, their port of arcade game Penetrator became the biggest selling game of the year. After developing several more computer programming books, Beam finally decided that software production was the way to go. They branched out into software packages such as Melbourne Draw and, get ready for it, the high-level, user-friendly, real-time game designer, or HERG for short. Sorry about that. At this point, the 12-strong team had moved into their new offices in Richmond, Melbourne. The Hobbit had catapulted the young team to the top, cementing them as a developer to watch and gaining them a firm foothold in the industry. Reviews were glowing, and the best was yet to come. In 1985, Way of the Exploding Fist for the Commodore 64 and various home computers was released. Developed by the talented Greg Barnett, it captured the public's imagination and won awards with its animation and sound design, which was very inspired for the time. Moves could be combined fluently and made players feel like they were trained masters. It is one of the earlier examples of a one-on-one fighter and is celebrated as a masterpiece among many older gamers. It sold 500,000 copies for the Commodore 64 alone and soared to #1 in Europe. Beam had another big hit on their hands, and it wouldn't be the last. Beam were on a roll. By 1986, they had secured 10% of the UK market alone. Games like Rock and Wrestle, the first home computer wrestling game, and Mugsy's Revenge, a comic book style adventure set in the Prohibition era, were all critically acclaimed. New licenses were picked up and produced, such as Fellowship of the Ring and Asterix. A sequel to Fist was developed, and at this time, it seemed Beam could do no wrong, except for the terrible Judge Dredd game. Not everything Beam touched turned to gold. Alas, financial problems began to rear their ugly heads. In 1987, Beam found that managing both video game development and publishing was no longer financially viable, so they sold their UK publishing arm Melbourne House to Mastertronic, a publisher and budget games label. It sold for £850,000. Now Beam could focus on game development exclusively, but it hadn't realised one very important point. The publisher could now mess with their creative freedoms. Thanks to contractual disputes, none of Beam's work from 1987 was released, and Mastertronic was then sold to Virgin Games, with the name of Melbourne House going with them. Beam Software was officially on their own, a separate entity with no publisher. This was not to be their end though. Oh no, the best was yet to come. I hope you will join me again for part 2, Reverse Engineering Success, which will cover the 90s golden era of Beam Software. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.
To develop games for Nintendo. Beam has invented this cricket game which will be sold internationally.